In 1910, a United States Navy convoy vanished in Alaskan waters after reporting a deep-sea discovery. When wreckage washed ashore weeks later, fragments of the logbook described an encounter with something massive, something that should have been extinct for millions of years. The Navy sealed the incident, and the official record states the convoy was lost to storms, but the few pages that survived told a different story. So, before we continue, make sure you subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The convoy departed Seattle on September 3, 1910, bound for the new naval station at Dutch Harbor. The morning was overcast, typical for the Pacific Northwest in early autumn, with low clouds pressing against the water and a fine mist that soaked everything it touched. The docks smelled of creosote and coal smoke, fish and salt water, the familiar sense of any working harbor. Longshoremen loaded the last crates of supplies while we completed our final inspections. The crews were in good spirits, joking and calling to each other across the decks. For most, this was routine duty, a supply run to a remote outpost, nothing more. A few weeks at sea, then back to Seattle with stories of the northern frontier. I stood at the rail of the USS Cormorant and watched the city recede as we made our way through Elliott Bay toward open water. The buildings grew smaller, the sounds of the harbor faded, and soon there was only the throb of our engines and the cry of gulls following in our wake. I felt the familiar settling that came with departure, the way the mind adjusts to being at sea, to the rhythm of watches and the routine of shipboard life. I had made this transition dozens of times in my 8 years of service. It felt natural, comfortable even. I had no premonition of what lay ahead, no sense of foreboding. The voyage stretched before me as a series of predictable tasks: navigate, maintain the charts, assist the captain, keep the log. Simple work for a trained officer. I was 32 years old, confident in my abilities, secure in my understanding of the sea and ships. That confidence would not survive the voyage. Our orders were straightforward: transport supplies, survey the coastal waters for suitable anchorage points, and assess the strategic value of the Aleutian chain. What we could not have known was that these waters held secrets far older and more terrible than any military concern. I was Lieutenant Commander James Holbrook, navigation officer aboard the lead vessel USS Cormorant. I kept the ship's log and maintained our charts. I had served 8 years in the Navy, seen action in the Spanish War, and considered myself a man of science and reason. I did not believe in sea monsters or sailors' superstitions. That skepticism would not survive the voyage. Captain Marcus Webb commanded our small convoy. The Cormorant, a patrol vessel of modest size built 5 years prior in the Philadelphia yards, and 2 coal transports, the Thresher and Anaconda. The Cormorant displaced 800 tons, carried a crew of 43, and mounted a single 3-inch deck gun forward. She was not built for combat but for patrol work, surveying coastlines, showing the flag in remote waters. Her steel hull was painted navy gray, already showing rust streaks from the constant assault of salt water, but she was sound, her engines reliable, and Captain Webb kept her well maintained. Webb was 52, gray-haired and stern, with deep lines around his eyes from years of squinting into sun and wind. He had entered the Navy as a young man, worked his way up through the enlisted ranks before receiving a commission, and had commanded vessels for 15 years. He was a career officer who ran his ship with precision and expected the same from his men. His cabin was Spartan, containing only the necessary furniture, his uniforms kept pressed and ready, his desk organized with military efficiency. He trusted instruments over instinct, preferred data to speculation, and had little patience for what he called sailors' talk, the superstitions and stories that circulated through any crew. He was a practical man, grounded in the reality of steam engines and steel hulls, of navigation by sextant and compass. The ocean was dangerous enough without inventing monsters to fear. Chief Engineer Daniel Pierce managed our engines with the devotion some men gave to religion. He was 45, Scottish by birth, though he had emigrated to America as a young man, and he treated the machinery in his charge as living things that required understanding and respect. Pierce could diagnose problems by sound alone, could tell from the pitch of the engines whether they were running true or developing some subtle fault. He kept the engine room spotless, every surface cleaned and oiled, every tool in its proper place. His crew loved him because he never asked them to do work he would not do himself, never blamed them for failures that were not their faults. But he could be fierce when standards slipped, and he had no tolerance for carelessness around machinery that could kill a man in seconds if mishandled. Dr. Henry Chen served as ship's surgeon, a quiet, thoughtful man of 38 who had grown up in San Francisco's Chinese district before attending medical school in Boston. He was one of perhaps 20 Chinese-American physicians in the entire country, having overcome barriers that would have stopped lesser men. He spoke with barely a trace of accent, dressed in perfectly tailored civilian suits even aboard ship, and kept mostly to his medical texts and scientific journals. At meals, he listened more than he spoke, observing everything with dark, intelligent eyes that missed little. Some of the crew were uncertain about him at first. A Chinese officer was uncommon in 1910, and prejudice ran deep. But Chen's competence and his gentle manner with the sick and injured had won them over. He had sewn up knife wounds from brawls, set broken bones, treated fevers and infections with equal skill. The men trusted him with their lives, which was all that mattered aboard ship. The other officers included boatswain's mate William Cross, a veteran of 20 years who had sailed everything from clipper ships to modern steel vessels, his face weathered and scarred, his hands permanently stained with tar and rope fiber. He knew every practical skill a sailor could possess and could teach those skills with a patience that belied his rough appearance. Ensign Thomas Hartley was fresh from the Naval Academy, 22 years old, eager and untested, full of theory but short on experience. He was learning quickly though, watching everything, asking questions, trying to understand how a ship truly functioned beyond what the textbooks taught. Radioman First Class Patrick Sullivan managed our wireless, one of the newer installations that still felt like magic to many aboard. Sullivan was 30, Irish by ancestry and temperament, who could coax signals from the ether when conditions were poor and who maintained his equipment with fanatical care. The crew numbered 43 men in total on the Cormorant, with similar complements on the transports. Most were career sailors, men who knew the sea and respected its dangers but did not fear it unduly. They had survived storms and accidents, mechanical failures and fires. They were competent and professional, the kind of men the Navy relied upon to keep its vessels running in the remotest corners of the world. They trusted their officers and their ship. That trust would be tested in ways none of us could have imagined. We sailed north through calm waters for the first 5 days. The weather held fair, unusual for September in these latitudes. The sea lay flat as glass some mornings, reflecting clouds so perfectly you could not tell where ocean ended and sky began. We made good time, our formation steady, the coal smoke from our stacks trailing behind in straight lines. On the 6th day, we passed through the Strait of Juan de Fuca and entered truly open ocean. The swells increased, long rollers that lifted us gently and set us down. Seabirds followed in our wake, diving for the small fish churned up by our passage. Everything seemed routine. Everything felt normal. Captain Webb called me to his cabin that evening to review our charts. We spread them across his table, waited at the corners with books. He traced our route with a calloused finger, marking our position and projecting our arrival at Dutch Harbor in 4 more days. The maps showed the coastline in rough detail, but the ocean depths were largely unmapped, marked with scattered soundings that revealed little of what lay beneath. "We'll take a sounding tomorrow morning," Webb said. "The charts show deep water here, but I want confirmation before we proceed further along this route. Make a note in the log." I did so, writing carefully in the leather-bound book that recorded everything of significance. Sounding at dawn, position 54 degrees north, 157 degrees west. The routine of naval procedure, the comforting structure of orders and compliance. I had no reason to think this sounding would be anything but routine. We lowered the sounding line at first light. The ocean had changed overnight in ways that were subtle but disturbing. The swells that had rolled beneath us for days had flattened completely, leaving the surface smooth as polished glass. A strange calm had settled over the water, the kind of unnatural stillness that sometimes precedes violent weather, but which our barometer did not predict. The air pressure was steady. The sky showed no threatening formations. Yet something felt wrong. No birds called. That was the first thing I noticed. Throughout the voyage, we had been accompanied by gulls and petrels, diving birds that followed ships for the scraps, and the fish churned up by our passage. But this morning, the sky was empty. Not a single bird could be seen in any direction. The usual sounds of wind and waves seemed muted, as if someone had placed a blanket over the world. The air felt thick and still, hard to draw into the lungs, oppressive in a way that made my chest tight. Boatswain Cross supervised the sounding crew. 6 men working the heavy line marked at regular intervals with colored rags. They were experienced sailors who had performed this task hundreds of times, and they went about it with practiced efficiency. The lead weight, a cylinder of iron 20 pounds in mass, was attached to the line and readied. On Cross's command, they paid it out over the side, the line hissing through their gloved hands as it descended into the dark water. The line ran out steadily. 100 fathoms, 600 feet of depth, 200 fathoms, 300. The men exchanged glances but said nothing, concentrating on their work. This was far deeper than our charts indicated for this position. The old British surveys from the 1870s had marked this area as relatively shallow, no more than 200 fathoms at the deepest points. Yet our line continued running without finding bottom. At 400 fathoms, Cross called for more line to be brought up from below. 2 men disappeared down a hatch and returned with another coil, which they spliced to the existing line with quick, sure movements. The sounding continued. 500 fathoms, 600. The men had gone completely silent now, their faces showing concern. We had brought 800 fathoms of line, enough for almost any depth in these waters according to every chart we carried. Running out that much line was unusual. Running out more than that would mean we were over some previously unmapped deep, some trench or canyon that the surveys had missed. At 700 fathoms, 4,200 feet, something tugged the line. It was not the solid strike of bottom hitting the lead weight. It was a pull, gentle at first, then harder, more insistent. The line went taut and began to angle away from vertical, dragging away from the ship. "Belay!" Cross shouted. The men gripped the line and held it fast. The pull came again, stronger now, a steady pressure that made the line creak. Whatever had caught the weight was pulling it, deliberately and with significant force. The line vibrated under the strain. Then suddenly it went slack all at once. The tension vanished completely. The men hauled it up, hand over hand, coiling it as it came aboard. The work was hard, the line waterlogged and heavy, and it took nearly half an hour to retrieve 700 fathoms of wet rope. When the end finally appeared over the rail, dripping and dark, the lead weight was gone. But more than that, the rope itself told a disturbing story. The break was clean, perfectly clean. The rope fibers were not frayed or worn through as they would be if the weight had snagged on rocks or coral. They were spread and broken in a pattern that suggested they had been cut or bitten. I had seen rope severed by knife before, and this looked similar. But what knife could reach 700 fathoms beneath the surface? What could exert enough force to shear through heavy-sounding line in a single motion? Captain Webb examined the line himself, running his fingers over the clean break. He brought the end close to his face, studying the individual fibers. His expression revealed nothing, but I saw his jaw tighten, the muscle jumping beneath the skin. He looked at the water, flat and dark and empty, then back at the rope. "Mark the depth in the log," he said finally. His voice was controlled, betraying no emotion. 700 fathoms, no bottom reached. Note that the weight was lost to unknown causes. I wrote it down in the leather-bound log, my handwriting neat despite the unease growing in my chest. 700 fathoms, no bottom, weight lost, unknown causes. The words seemed inadequate somehow to capture what had just happened. Something had severed that line at 4,000 feet beneath the surface. Coral could catch a line, yes, A sharp rock formation could snag it, certainly, but the ocean floor was thought to be smooth at such depths, nothing but silt and mud, and the slow accumulation of debris falling from above. Nothing down there should be able to cut heavy rope so cleanly. Nothing that we knew of. We continued north. The strange calm persisted through the morning. By afternoon, a fog had begun to gather, rising from the surface like steam. It thickened until we could barely see the bow from the wheelhouse. Captain Webb ordered the formation to close up, signal lamps flashing through the gray murk. The transports acknowledged, their lights dim and wavering in the fog. At 4 bells in the afternoon watch, 2 o'clock by civilian reckoning, a cry came from the forward lookout. The man's voice carried clear across the deck, sharp with an emotion I could not immediately identify. Not quite fear, but certainly not calm observation. Something in the water, port side, 2 points off the bow. I joined Captain Webb at the port rail, raising my binoculars before I had fully reached his side. Through the lenses, the fog appeared as a gray blur, shifting and flowing. I scanned the area where the lookout had indicated, sweeping slowly from left to right. At first I saw nothing but fog and water. Then movement caught my eye. A disturbance in the surface, perhaps 200 yards distant. The water bulged upward in a smooth dome, as if something beneath was displacing it. The dome broke, and for just a moment I saw a dark shape, sleek and massive, before it submerged again. The movement was fluid, controlled, nothing like the random thrashing of a fish or the explosive blow of a whale breaching. I lowered the binoculars and looked at Captain Webb. He was still watching through his own glasses, his face set in concentration. Around us, other men had gathered at the rail, pointing and talking in low voices. The word spread quickly through the ship. Something in the water. Something large. "All stop," Webb ordered. The telegraph rang, and I felt the vibration of the engines change beneath my feet. The cormorant settled into the water, her momentum carrying her forward for perhaps half a minute before she came to rest, drifting. The sudden silence was profound. Without the steady thrum of the engines, I could hear individual voices, the lap of water against the hull, the creak of rigging. The transports behind us slowed as well, their crews no doubt wondering why we had stopped. We waited. Every man at the rail stared at the spot where the disturbance had been. The fog swirled and eddied, revealing nothing. Minutes passed. 5, 10. Nothing moved. The surface remained flat and empty. I began to wonder if we had imagined it, if the fog and the strange light had created an illusion, but I knew what I had seen. Something large had been there, something that moved with purpose. "Whale," Webb said at last, lowering his binoculars. His voice carried the weight of command, the certainty that defined his every decision. Had to be a whale. They're common in these waters. Resume course and speed. The telegraph rang again. The engines built back to cruising power. The cormorant began to move, her bow cutting a white wake through the gray water. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what we had seen was not a whale. The shape had been wrong. Whales were rotund, their bodies designed for their immense size. What I had glimpsed had been sleek, streamlined, built for speed rather than bulk. And the movement had been too purposeful, too controlled, lacking the characteristic roll and blow of a breaching whale. I said nothing. Captain Webb did not tolerate speculation from his officers. He valued facts, measurements, concrete observations. Saying it moved wrong or the shape seemed unusual would only mark me as unreliable in his eyes. So I kept my doubts to myself and returned to my duties, trying to convince myself that Webb was right. It had been a whale. The fog had distorted its appearance. There was no reason for concern. That night, as the ship settled into the routine of the evening watch, we began to hear sounds through the hull. At first I thought it was machinery noise, perhaps something in the engine room resonating in an unusual way, but when I went below to check, Chief Pierce assured me that all equipment was running normally, that the sounds were not originating from our systems. They were deep sounds, resonant and low, felt more than heard, a throbbing pulse that seemed to come from beneath us, from the depths themselves. It penetrated the steel of the ship, traveling through the frame and into our bodies. I could feel it in my chest, a rhythmic pressure that matched no natural phenomenon I knew of. The pulses came at regular intervals, perhaps 15 seconds apart, each one lasting 3 or 4 seconds before fading. I stood in my cabin with my hand pressed against the bulkhead, feeling the vibrations. They were not random. They were too regular, too consistent to be geological activity. Underwater volcanic vents sometimes produce sounds. I knew that from my reading. Earthquakes could create pressure waves that traveled through water, but those were chaotic, unpredictable. These sounds had a rhythm to them, almost like breathing, like the breathing of something massive, something alive. The men on watch reported the sounds to the officer of the deck, Ensign Hartley, who dutifully recorded them in the deck log as unidentified underwater sounds, possibly geological in origin. When I read his entry later, I could see he had hesitated before writing geological. The word was underlined twice, as if he were trying to convince himself of its accuracy. In the crew quarters, the sounds created unease that spread like a physical thing. I went forward to speak with Boatswain Cross and found him sitting with a group of men, all of them silent, listening. Their faces showed the strain of uncertainty, of facing something they could not understand or combat. "It's nothing, lads," Cross told them, his voice steady despite what must have been his own doubts. "Just the ocean making noises. Happens all the time in deep water. Shifting sediment on the bottom, that sort of thing. Nothing to concern yourselves with." But his words rang hollow, and we all knew it. The sounds continued for nearly an hour. That slow, steady pulse felt through the ship. Then gradually they began to fade. The intervals between pulses grew longer. The intensity decreased. Finally they stopped altogether, leaving behind a silence that somehow felt worse than the sounds had been. I lay in my bunk afterward trying to sleep, but my mind would not settle. I kept thinking about the sounding line, severed at 700 fathoms, the disturbance in the water during the fog, the crushed fishing vessel and the men with their bones broken and those terrible teeth marks on their bodies. Pieces of a puzzle that I did not want to solve because I feared the answer too much. Around me the ship creaked and groaned with normal sounds of steel contracting in the cool night air. The engines maintained their steady rhythm. Water rushed along the hull, all familiar, all normal. Yet beneath it all, I felt certain something was listening. Something was aware of our passage through its domain. Something ancient and powerful was tracking us through the dark water, and we were as helpless as mice in a field while an owl circles overhead. The next morning brought clear skies and a fresh breeze. The fog had lifted and the ocean sparkled in the sunlight. The crew seemed relieved, their spirits lifting with the weather. Perhaps it had been geological sounds. Perhaps the disturbance had been a whale. In daylight, fears seemed foolish. We were making good time when the Anaconda sent a signal by lamp. Engine trouble. They were reducing speed for repairs. Captain Webb ordered the convoy to hold position while the transport's engineers addressed the problem. We drifted, engines at idle, waiting. I was at the chart table when Ensign Hartley burst into the wheelhouse. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Sir, you need to see this. Off the starboard bow." We followed him to the rail. What I saw made my breath catch. The water ahead of us was churning. A circular disturbance perhaps 50 yards across. Fish were leaping from the water, hundreds of them, scattering in panic. And beneath the surface, visible in the clear water, something moved. It was massive beyond comprehension. A dark shape, long and broad, passing under our bow at a depth I could not estimate. The shadow of it darkened the water, and as it moved, I saw the edge of a tail fin. The tail alone was wider than our ship was long. It swept once, slowly, and the water boiled. Then it was gone, descending into the depths. Captain Webb stood frozen at the rail. His hand gripped the wood so tightly his knuckles had gone white. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "All ahead full. Signal the convoy to form up and proceed at maximum speed." The telegraph rang frantically. The engines roared to life. Black smoke poured from our stack as the boilers were pushed to their limits. The Thresher and Anaconda responded, their own engines accelerating. We drove north at 18 knots, the fastest our convoy could sustain. "What was that?" Hartley asked. His voice shook. "I don't know," Webb said, "and I don't want to find out. Log it as an unidentified marine animal. Large whale. Nothing more." But we both knew it was not a whale. No whale grew that large. No whale had a tail fin that size. What we had seen belonged to something else entirely. Something that should not exist in these waters or any waters. For 6 hours we ran at full speed. The coal transport struggled to keep pace, their smaller engines laboring. Eventually, Captain Webb ordered a reduction to cruising speed. We could not maintain that pace indefinitely, and whatever we had seen had not followed. That evening I consulted the reference books in the ship's small library. I found descriptions of great whales, of giant squid, of basking sharks. Nothing matched what we had seen. Then I found an old natural history volume, yellowed pages describing prehistoric creatures. There was a chapter on ancient sharks, species that had lived millions of years ago. One entry caught my attention. Carcharodon Megalodon, the megatooth shark. The text described a predator of enormous size, possibly 60 feet or more in length. Fossil teeth as large as a man's hand had been found. The creature had dominated the oceans during the Miocene epoch, feeding on whales. It was believed extinct for at least 2 million years. The illustration showed a massive shark with a triangular dorsal fin and a tail fin that could be 20 feet across. The proportions matched what I had seen, but it was impossible. Creatures did not survive for 2 million years unchanged. They did not hide in the depths undetected by science. I closed the book and returned it to the shelf. I would not mention this to Captain Webb. He would think me mad. Perhaps I was mad. Perhaps the stress of command and the isolation of these waters was affecting my judgment. We maintained our course through the night. The sea remained calm. No sounds echoed through the hull. Perhaps we had sailed beyond whatever territory that creature claimed. Perhaps it had been a fluke, a single aberration that we would never see again. At dawn on the 8th day, everything changed. The lookout spotted debris in the water ahead just after dawn. I was on watch, having relieved Ensign Hartley at 4 bells. The sky was lightening in the east, painting the clouds pink and gold, when the call came down from the crow's nest. Wreckage ahead, dead in the water, perhaps half a mile distant. As we drew closer, the true nature of what we were seeing became clear. Wooden planks floated scattered across the surface, some still joined in sections, others broken and splintered. Canvas torn from sails or protective coverings drifted in the current. Shattered crates spilled their contents. Cans of food, coils of rope, tools, all the ordinary supplies a fishing vessel might carry, and bodies. 3 of them, floating face down in their cork life jackets, their arms spread wide as if they had been swimming when death took them. Captain Webb ordered us to slow and investigate. We approached carefully, the engines at quarter speed, the bow wave minimal so as not to further disperse the debris. Men lined the rails, silent, staring at the wreckage. Some made the sign of the cross. Others simply watched with expressions that mixed horror and fascination. We found the remains of the vessel itself perhaps 100 yards from the main debris field. What was left of it, at any rate? The fishing trawler had been perhaps 50 feet in length, a sturdy working boat built to handle the rough seas and hard work of commercial fishing. Its name was still visible on a section of the bow that remained relatively intact, the Mary Catherine, registered out of Ketchikan. But the rest of the vessel had been torn apart with violence that defied comprehension. The hull was split open, its wooden ribs crushed inward as if struck by something massive. Not torn from the outside in, but crushed, the wood splintered and driven inward with tremendous force. 20 feet of the stern was simply gone, sheared off in what must have been a single, catastrophic impact. The break was not clean. It was ragged, splintered, with some of the planking bent back on itself, but the violence of it was undeniable. We recovered the 3 bodies, hauling them aboard with boat hooks and lines. It was grim work. The men who brought them up were silent, their faces pale. We laid them on the deck and Dr. Chen came forward to examine them. I watched as he knelt beside each man in turn, his fingers gentle despite the horror of what he was seeing. When he had completed his examination, he stood and walked with Captain Webb and me to the stern, away from the crew and the bodies. "These men were crushed," Chen said quietly. His voice was steady, but I could see the effect the examination had had on him. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped them on a cloth. Multiple bones broken in each body, ribs, spine, pelvis, limbs. The force required would be enormous, far beyond what a collision with rocks or another vessel could cause, and the pattern of the injuries is consistent across all three men, suggesting they were caught by the same force at roughly the same time. "What could do this?" Webb asked. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the strain beneath it. Chen shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Captain, but there's something else." He gestured for us to follow him back to the bodies. Kneeling beside the nearest man, he pulled back the torn coat and shirt to expose the torso. Deep gouges ran across the man's chest and side, parallel lines that had torn through the fabric and into the flesh beneath. The wounds were cleanly edged, not ragged like a blow from debris would leave. "These are teeth marks," Chen said. He indicated the spacing between the gouges. "Very large teeth. Based on the width and depth of these marks, I would estimate each tooth was at least 4 inches long, possibly longer. And there are multiple parallel marks, suggesting a row of teeth striking simultaneously." I stared at the wounds. 4-inch teeth, multiple rows. No fish I knew of had teeth that size. No shark, no whale. Nothing in any natural history text I had ever read, except one. One creature described in that old book I had found in the ship's library. But that was impossible. That creature had been extinct for millions of years. We buried the men at sea that afternoon with full military honors. Captain Webb conducted the service himself, reading from the Book of Common Prayer in a voice that carried clearly despite the wind that had risen. As I stood at attention and listened to the familiar words, I looked out at the calm water and wondered what had killed these men. I already knew the answer, in my bones if not yet in my conscious thoughts. I just did not want to admit it to myself. Captain Webb convened a meeting with the officers in his cabin. His face was drawn and tired. He had not slept since we found the wreckage. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are in a difficult situation. Our orders are to proceed to Dutch Harbor, but we have encountered something in these waters that poses a significant danger to shipping. I am obliged to report this to Fleet Command." "What exactly are we reporting, sir?" Chief Engineer Pierce asked. "That we saw a large fish? That a fishing boat was destroyed by unknown causes?" "We're reporting exactly what we observed," Webb said firmly. "No speculation, just facts. A marine animal of exceptional size, wreckage indicating violent destruction of a vessel, 3 deaths. The Navy will decide what to do with that information." Radioman Sullivan drafted the message that afternoon. It was transmitted in code, a brief summary of our observations and the wreckage we had found. We requested instructions on whether to continue to Dutch Harbor or return to Seattle for further briefing. The reply came 3 hours later. "Proceed to Dutch Harbor as ordered. Maintain radio silence unless attacked. Make detailed observations and compile full report on arrival." The message was signed by the Commandant himself, which told me our report had reached the highest levels quickly. We continued north, now on high alert. Extra lookouts were posted, and the crew went about their duties with nervous efficiency. Everyone had heard about the wreckage and the bodies. Rumors spread despite our efforts to contain them. The men were frightened, and I could not blame them. On the 9th day it found us again. The attack came at mid-morning. The sea was choppy, white caps breaking in the fresh wind. I was on the bridge when the Anaconda sent an emergency signal. Under attack, assistance required. Through my binoculars I saw the transport wallowing in the water, listing hard to port. Then I saw the cause, a triangular fin, gray and enormous, circling the stricken vessel. The fin stood at least 6 feet out of the water, moving with terrifying purpose. "Battle stations," Captain Webb ordered. The alarm rang throughout the ship. Men rushed to their positions. Our deck gun was manned and loaded. We turned toward the Anaconda at full speed. The creature struck the transport again. The impact was visible from our position, a massive upwelling of water as something enormous slammed into the hull. The Anaconda shuddered and took on a steeper list. Men were abandoning ship, jumping into the cold water, swimming desperately away from their vessel. We closed the distance. The gun crew had a clear shot at the fin circling the transport. Captain Webb hesitated only a moment. "Fire!" The deck gun roared. The shell struck the water 10 feet from the fin, sending up a geyser. The creature did not react. It continued its circle, preparing for another strike. Reload. Fire at will. 3 more shots, each one closer. The 4th shell struck the fin directly. We saw the impact, saw the spray of blood and tissue. The fin disappeared beneath the surface. For a moment I thought we had killed it. Then the cormorant was lifted from the water, the entire bow rising as something struck us from below with unimaginable force. I was thrown against the bulkhead, my head striking steel. The world spun. When my vision cleared, the ship was settling back into the water. Damage reports came in rapidly. Hull breach in the forward hold. Water pouring in. All pumps to forward compartments. Damage control parties responding. Through the chaos, I saw it. The creature had surfaced 50 yards away. Its head broke the water, and for the first time I saw it clearly. The head was enormous, wider than a bus, triangular and brutal in its efficiency. The mouth was partially open, revealing rows of teeth like white daggers, each one the size of a man's forearm. The eye was the size of a dinner plate, black and empty, reflecting nothing. This was not a fish. This was not an animal in any sense I understood. This was a living weapon, perfectly designed for killing. The Megalodon regarded us for perhaps 10 seconds. In that time, every man on deck stood frozen. We were insects to this creature. We were nothing. Then it dove, the massive tail rising briefly. Before sliding beneath the surface, the water churned white, and it was gone. "Damage report!" Captain Webb's voice cut through the shock. Chief Pierce reported from below. The breach was contained but not sealed. We were taking on water faster than the pumps could handle. We might have 6 hours before the flooding became critical. The Anaconda was sinking, her crew in the water. The Thresher was standing by to pick up survivors. "Make for Dutch Harbor," Webb ordered. "Best possible speed. Signal the Thresher to follow with survivors. We cannot stay here." We limped north, our bow sitting low in the water from the flooding forward. The pumps ran constantly, fighting a losing battle against the sea. Behind us, the Anaconda disappeared beneath the waves. We recovered 21 men from her crew. 34 were lost. The creature followed us. We saw the fin periodically throughout the day, keeping pace a quarter-mile behind. It made no further attacks. It simply followed, as if curious or waiting for us to weaken further. Night fell and we continued north in darkness. The moon was full, turning the ocean silver. I stood on the bridge wing and watched that fin cutting through the moonlit water, never closer, never farther, always there. "It's intelligent," Dr. Chen said beside me. I had not heard him approach. "It's learning about us, testing us." "That's impossible," I said. "It's a shark, an oversized shark, but still just an animal." "Is it?" Chen gestured toward the distant fin. "It attacked the weakest ship first. It struck us from below, where we couldn't see it. Now it's following at a distance where our gun cannot reach it. That suggests tactical thinking, not mere instinct." I had no answer. I watched the fin and felt a deep chill that had nothing to do with the night air. At dawn on the 10th day, we sighted land. The Aleutian Islands rose from the sea ahead, dark volcanic peaks shrouded in cloud. Dutch Harbor lay beyond them, perhaps 8 hours away at our current speed. We might make it, we might survive. The flooding forward had worsened during the night. We were down to 3 hours before the pumps would be overwhelmed. Chief Pierce had done everything possible, but the breach was too large to properly seal under these conditions. We needed a shipyard, not makeshift repairs. The Megalodon had disappeared with the dawn. The lookouts reported no sighting of the fin. Perhaps it had given up the chase, perhaps it had other prey to hunt, or perhaps it was simply below us, waiting. We threaded through the outer islands, following the channel markers toward Dutch Harbor. The water here was shallower, no more than 50 fathoms in most places. too shallow for a creature of that size to maneuver easily. We might be safe. The attack came without warning. The Megalodon rose from the depths directly ahead, breaching completely out of the water. For one impossible moment I saw the entire creature suspended in air. It was at least 60 feet long, possibly 70. The body was massive and torpedo-shaped, dark gray above fading to white below. The dorsal fin was huge and swept back. The tail fin was crescent-shaped and powerful, built for speed. Scars covered its hide, white lines and gouges from battles I could not imagine. Then it came down. The impact struck our bow dead center, and the sound was like a bomb exploding. The forward deck crumpled like paper. The foremast came down, rigging and all, crashing across the deck. Men screamed. Alarms rang. The ship shuddered and began to list. Captain Webb shouted orders, his voice somehow cutting through the chaos. Abandon ship. All hands to the boats. Wireless operator to send distress signal. Engines full astern. The engines screamed as Pierce threw them into reverse, trying to back us away from the creature. But the damage was too great. The forward hold was flooding catastrophically now. The bow dipped lower with each second. I helped launch the boats, getting men into them as quickly as possible. The Thresher had closed to assist, lowering her own boats. Through it all I could see the Megalodon circling, that massive fin cutting through the water in a wide arc around our dying ship. Captain Webb was the last man on the bridge. I climbed back aboard against orders to get him. He was at the safe, extracting the confidential documents and the ship's log. "We need to go, sir," I shouted. "The log must be preserved," he said. "The Navy needs to know what happened here." We made it to the last boat just as the cormorant's bow went under. The deck tilted at a steep angle and we slid down into the boat. 4 strong men rowed us away from the sinking ship. The Megalodon struck again, this time hitting the cormorant's stern. The propellers were torn away, the rudder crushed. The ship's back broke with a sound like artillery fire. She split in two, both halves rising at steep angles before sliding beneath the surface. I watched my ship die, watched her disappear into the dark water, taking with her everything I knew of naval service and procedure and reason. Gone in minutes, destroyed by something that science said could not exist. The Megalodon surfaced one last time. It hung there, 20 yards from our boats, regarding us with that dead black eye. Blood leaked from the wound on its dorsal fin where our shell had struck. The wound was minor, barely an inconvenience to something so massive. Then it dove, the tail rising high before sliding under. The water churned and settled. It was gone. The Thresher picked us up. We were ferried aboard, wet and shaking. 38 survivors from the Cormorant's complement of 43. We had lost 5 men in the attack, crushed when the mast came down or swept away in the flooding. We made Dutch Harbor by evening. The naval station there was small, barely more than a coaling depot with a few buildings. But they had a working radio, and within hours our story was transmitted back to Fleet Command in Seattle. Captain Webb spent that night writing his report, filling page after page with precise technical language, dimensions of the creature, description of its attack patterns, assessment of the threat it posed to naval operations. He recommended that all shipping be diverted from this region until the creature could be dealt with. I contributed my observations, including my research into prehistoric sharks. The Megalodon was not just a name from a book. It was real, alive, and hunting in Alaskan waters. The Navy's response came 2 days later. All personnel were ordered to sign confidentiality agreements. The incident was classified. No public statements would be made. The official record would show that USS Cormorant and transport Anaconda were lost in a severe storm, casualties of unfortunate weather in dangerous waters. We were reassigned to different ships and different commands. Captain Webb received a commendation for his handling of the emergency and was given command of a new vessel. The bodies recovered from the fishing trawler were buried without investigation. The whole affair was sealed away in classified files. I protested, of course. I argued that other ships needed to know the danger, that fishermen and merchant vessels working these waters deserved warning. I was told in no uncertain terms that such knowledge would cause panic, would harm commerce, would serve no useful purpose. The creature was probably already dead from the wound we inflicted. And if not, it would eventually die of old age or starvation. The threat would resolve itself. They were wrong. In the years since, there have been other disappearances in Alaskan waters. Fishing boats that vanished without trace. Cargo ships that sent distress calls describing impossible attacks before going silent. Each time, the Navy investigated quietly and filed the reports away in classified archives. I am old now, past 70, my career long finished. I have kept silent as ordered for decades, bound by the oath I took and the agreements I signed. But the log I kept, the original ship's log of the Cormorant's final voyage, I preserved. I kept it hidden, knowing that someday the truth would need to be told. The Megalodon is real. It lives in the deep waters off Alaska, probably in a trench or underwater canyon where the ocean plunges to extraordinary depths. It has survived there, undiscovered by science for millions of years. Perhaps there is more than one. Perhaps there is a breeding population that we never imagined could exist. The creature is intelligent enough to be dangerous, to learn and adapt. It is large enough to destroy any vessel it chooses to attack. And it is patient. It can wait in the depths, rising only when hunger drives it or when something intrudes on its territory. I do not know if it can be killed. Our weapons barely scratched it. Modern depth charges and torpedoes might have better effect, but I doubt the Navy has made any serious effort. To do so would require admitting the creature exists, and that admission would open too many uncomfortable questions. So it remains there, in the cold dark waters of the North Pacific. A living fossil, a nightmare from the deep past. Sailors who work those waters know to be careful. They see things sometimes, shadows moving beneath the surface, fins too large to belong to any whale. They report them and are told it was their imagination, but they know better. Some of them have seen what I saw. Some have survived encounters they cannot explain, and when ships disappear in those waters, when distress calls speak of impacts from below and massive shapes in the deep, some of us understand what really happened. The truth remains classified. The Navy keeps its secrets, but I am done keeping mine. This log, these observations, this testimony, stands as record of what we found in September 1910. Let those who read it judge whether the silence was justified. Let them decide if the protection of shipping lanes and preservation of commerce was worth the lives lost to a creature we pretended did not exist. I have seen the Megalodon. I have looked into its dead black eye and felt the terror of being prey. I know it lives still, somewhere in the darkness beneath the waves, and I know that one day someone will encounter it again. When they do, I hope they survive to tell the story. I hope they do not remain silent as I was forced to remain. The deep ocean keeps many secrets. Some should perhaps stay hidden. But this one, this truth, deserves to be known. There are monsters in the deep, ancient things that predate human civilization by millions of years. Things that see us not as masters of the sea, but as food, as intruders, as brief disturbances in waters they have dominated since before our species existed. Respect those waters, fear them when appropriate, and know that when you sail over the deep trenches of the North Pacific, you are not alone. Something watches from below, something that has killed and will kill again, something that defies everything we think we know about what can and cannot exist in our modern age. The Megalodon lives. I have seen it, and that truth, however inconvenient or terrifying, must finally be acknowledged. For more interesting stories, check this out.